Thank you, Els, for this wonderful introduction. Today I'm going to talk about multilingualism, more specifically about historical multilingualism and about manuscripts. I hope you can see my PowerPoint, everything is okay, and then I'll take off. So let me start with a medieval song. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing, but I'm going to discuss this with you. The song was written down around 1400 in one of the most famous Bruges manuscripts, and everyone knows which manuscript I'm going to talk about, which is the Bruges manuscript. It's a convolute holding different songs and poems, a repertoire of an artist, probably of the Bruges poet Jan van Hulst. The song I'd like to present is actually the song De Kapelaan van Oedelem, and it recounts the humorous tale of a chaplain from Oedelem, a small village near Bruges. And instead of conducting mass, the chaplain persuades his sexton to join him and stand guard while he has an affair with his neighbor's wife. Inevitably, of course, the chaplain is caught by the woman's husband. The song is intended as a comedic satire, poking fun at rural clergymen who were seen as less sophisticated than the urban counterparts, because it was an urban environment this manuscript was written in. So probably to add to the comedy of the song, the refrain is likely based on a contemporary francophone love song, de Botakalagie de Madamour Sondi, de Botakalagie de Madamour de Voustravi. Many have tried to interpret these lines, with most influentially Heroma, who translates it as de beauté qu'à l'agit de mal d'amour sont dit, de beauté qu'à l'agit de mal d'amour de Voustravi, which translates as of beauty that eases my love's pains, I sing a little song. Of beauty that eases my love's pains, and excuse me for this, I live from screwing. It's written down probably quite intentionally, phonetically, gibberish, it seems to us, but quite funny, perhaps to contemporaries who would, of course, have known the pop song it referred to. But to us now, its exact comical meaning is perhaps lost in historical translation. So multilingualism is often viewed as a modern phenomenon, strongly linked to migration and globalization. And every year there are studies published on the pros and cons of multilingualism, in particular in work environments and education, as you can see here on the slide. Oh, something is, yeah. But multilingualism, of course, also has a history. As a Belgian myself, multilingualism is almost part of the Belgian DNA, but we tend to forget that this goes way back. The medieval Low Countries in general were indeed fundamentally multilingual, but different than today. While Latin continued to be an important player in the interregional, scholarly, religious fields, the vernacular realm saw Dutch and French dialects in constant contact with each other. French, in particular, Picard, played an important role as an aristocratic, also an administrative, an interregional almost language in Dutch-speaking areas as well. So today, I'd like to explore this topic of historical multilingualism with you.
Lisa?
Sorry? Yeah?
Sorry for interrupting, but I think we're not seeing the correct slide. We're still on the second one with the Kapelaan van Oedelem.
Let's see, synchroniseer. Okay, yeah, sorry. Is it good now? No? Oh, yeah, now I'm completely out. I don't know what I did wrong. I'll try again. Presenteren. Okay. Is this okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to explore the topic of historical multilingualism today, offering my perspective from a historical point of view, of course, because I'm neither a linguist nor a literary historian. I aim to shed light on possibilities, on challenges of studying multilingualism in the past, using one specific type of source, literary manuscripts. So in the second part of my talk, I will introduce a project I worked on for several years, as Els already said, which actually delved into multilingual literary culture of medieval Flanders. And I'll focus on two specific case studies on Bruges as a specific location, and the other part on social context on gender. I hope this works. The fact that I focus both on place and social context stems from a key challenge I actually encountered early on when analyzing multilingualism in historical sources. Multilingualism itself carries a double meaning. On one hand, it refers to the individual ability to speak, read, and write in multiple languages, bilingualism, trilingualism, and so on. On the other hand, it describes a setting where multilingual languages are used within a particular community or venue, such as a region, a town, or even a family, a classroom. And these two interpretations, individual and societal multilingualism, are fundamentally different. For instance, you can have a multilingual community comprised entirely of monolingual individuals, or you can have multilingual individuals existing within a largely monolingual society. So in modern discussions, but also in discussions on historical multilingualism, I often feel these distinctions are blurred, leading to the confusion between personal linguistic capabilities and broader linguistic environments. And I think this distinction is critical to understanding how complex multilingualism actually is in history, but also today, of course. Interestingly, this sort of dichotomy has historical roots, tracing back to biblical tropes. Even today, individual multilingualism is often seen as an asset or a positive trait, while societal multilingualism, and as a Belgian, I can know, it's frequently perceived in a more negative light. This question whether multilingualism has negative or positive implications is, of course, not solely related to our modern globalizing world, because in the Middle Ages, multilingualism itself was also described in both positive and negative ways. So as you can see on the slide, on the one hand, medieval people understood quite well how a multilingual melting pot, so the utterances of different languages in a specific space or context, and the corresponding lack of communication and understanding resulted in conflicts and problems, which they led back to the biblical trope, of course, of the Tower of Babel. And on the other hand, medieval religious writers, for instance, they were intrigued by the miracle of Pentecost, so the empowerment by God to speak in different tongues, and medieval polyglot translators, bridging the gap between languages, were therefore actually held in quite high esteem. So in the field of multilingualism research, one of the most influential contributions comes from Marie-Louise Pratt, particularly her concept of the contact zone, which was introduced in 1991, which was also the year I was born. The contact zone refers to social spaces where cultures intersect, often marked by conflict, negotiation, struggle, typically within the context of significant power imbalances, such as those seen in colonialism, slavery. So Pratt's analysis focused heavily on colonial context in the early modern period, which particular attention to cultural encounters between Spanish colonizers and the Inca civilization. As highlighted in her work, such interactions are exemplified by sources like Kesha Chronicles, which not only adopt Christian religious elements, but also integrate linguistic features from the colonizers. And you can see an example of this on the slide. And we see the Virgin Mary and Child with also Inca religious symbols. So this illustrates, according to Pratt, the dynamics of sort of transculturation and bilingualism, which he calls arts of the contact zone. But Pratt really actually emphasizes the perils of the contact zone, so including risk of misconception, misunderstanding. So since Pratt's influential conceptualization of the contact zone, more and more researchers define a multilingual contact zone actually in a more positive light, so not in a negative way, Pratt describes it, but as a place or a space where different languages interact in an enriching way, stimulating cultural but also social exchange. And in particular, Simon Ghent and Jonathan Sy are very influential in this way, and they characterize a multilingual contact zone as, and I quote, any venue, such as a city, that facilitates ongoing interactions between people and exchange among languages. And Sy, in particular, he examines how multilingualism, travel, and trade shaped texts written in late medieval London. And he argued how commerce in medieval contact zones, particularly in cities and coastal environments, profoundly influenced how language is used in literary texts. So historical multilingualism in the Low Countries has been analyzed from these various angles before, and the most common approach actually focuses on this sort of spatial division, or perhaps the more modern idea of a language border, which of course supposedly dates back to the Roman occupation. And for instance, in their edited volume on the use of French as a literary language outside of France, Nicolas Morato and Dirk Schoenaerts make place and geography central, actually, in their analysis of multilingualism. But social context is another approach, and it's Christopher Kleinhans and Keith Busby that have shown the importance of cultural but also social factors in the choice of language for specific texts. However, medieval texts and manuscripts could be multifunctional. Texts were first aimed at a courtly milieu. They could also reach additional audiences, just as manuscript produced in monastic context could move into an urban environment. And it's Adrian Armstrong and Elsa Streetman who have referred to this as transcultural. But I prefer to use the word multifunctional because the concept multifunctional sort of foregrounds different user contexts rather than different cultures. And so it bypasses the question of how one might define a culture. Is it language, actually, which is a discussion on its own, I think. So this dichotomy between individual and societal multilingualism is actually very accurate for medieval Low Countries, and in particular for Flanders, the county of Flanders. And indeed, the population of Walloon Flanders, and I hope my pointer works here, which is here in the south. These castellanies of Lille and Douai spoke Picard. They were dominantly Francophone with Picard French, whereas the northern part of Flanders had an overall Dutch-speaking community. In addition to place, there is, of course, a social aspect to languages in Flanders as well. The Flemish court, for example, was predominantly Francophone, and even in the northern part of the county, where trade centers and industries were developing in Ghent, in Bruges, and in Ypres, French was the language of culture and economy for a significant proportion of the elites. So quickly, some terminology before I skip into the case studies. When I talk about dialects, regional languages, these are actually local or regional variations of a language, often differing in pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. A standard language is, of course, absent in the Middle Ages. Standard languages is a unified, standardized form of a language. Nowadays, in formal context, in education, in media, often. Vernacular refers to everyday language spoken by people in a particular region or group. Native language or mother tongue is the first language a person learns and usually speaks fluently from his childhood. Lingua franca is a common language used for communication between speakers of different native languages. For instance, English, as I'm speaking English now, but it's not my native language. In historical research, cosmopolitan language is often used to refer to these kind of common languages because cosmopolitan languages also have a sort of cultural or intellectual prestige and therefore transcending local boundaries, for instance, Latin, but also French in medieval Europe. Diglossia is a situation where two language varieties coexist within society, typically with distinctive roles. For instance, high variety language is used in a formal, official, or literary context. Low variety languages is used in everyday informal communication. Code switching is actually the practice of alternating between languages or language variations in conversation, often depending on the context. And this can include quoting someone, using technical terms, integrating words from another language, slang, for instance. Register is then the variation in language use depending on social context, ranging from formal academic papers, for instance, to informal casual conversations, social media. But what about the multilingual manuscripts now? So let me introduce you the project I worked on for 2 years. Multilingual Dynamics of Medieval Flanders. It was initiated by Bart Bissamuska at Utrecht University. And this project brought together a team of 3 postdoctoral researchers and 1 PhD student. It focused on a large-scale investigation of multilingual literary culture of medieval Flanders between the 13th and the 15th century, analyzing both texts and manuscripts. The research was supported by 2 distinct data sets, so one for manuscripts, one for text, and both data sets are already freely accessible on Zenodo in open access. And additionally, as also already mentioned, in next year, we will publish our new book. We're in the final phase now, a new book with Brepols presenting the final findings from the project. So together with Janneke Jansen, an excellent book historian who was my colleague during this project, I set up a data set of extant medieval Flemish manuscripts. So manuscripts produced in Flanders or written for a Flemish patron. So the project established a database of manuscripts produced in the county of Flanders and roughly dating from 1200 to 1500. And the dataset included metadata of around 2,500 manuscripts, including literary text only. So no documentary sources, but romances, chronicles, books of hours. We also included legal treatises and theological works. Of course, I'm going to be open about also the risk and the problems with the data sets. One major limitation, I think, is our reliance, of course, on extant manuscripts, meaning those that have survived to present day. So we didn't look at library lists, lost manuscripts. And we know, of course, from other research that the survival rate of manuscripts from the medieval period is problematic and is estimated to be around 7 to 9% only. And so this low survival rate is influenced by various factors, for instance, content, but also material value. Illuminated manuscripts, for example, were likely more valuable and therefore had a higher chance of being preserved. But also ownership is important. Manuscripts owned by private individuals generally had a lower survival rate compared to those held in institutional collections, for instance, abbeys. So the data set was also compiled, which is another problem, I think, largely from library catalogs during COVID. It was a period we worked on this project. But at the time, I think metadata of library catalogs is very, very much better now. But at the time, origin attribution in library catalogs was actually highly problematic, and particularly in older entries. So this is, of course, difficult because we want to find Flemish manuscripts, but what is a Flemish manuscript? So as a result, we have been quite strict, and we only include manuscripts in our data set that could be attributed to a Flemish context with a relative certainty. So on the slide, you can see the database Janneke developed. It's a bit blurry, but I'll just discuss it. We had 6 main categories. General information, including shelf mark, date, century, origin, binding, is it a composite manuscript or not, folio number, amount of folios. Another category was text, so genre, authorship, text, languages, of course, which was important for us. Also a different tab for monolingual, multilingual, so we could select all the multilingual manuscripts at once. Is it a single text manuscript? Is it a multi-text manuscript? Another category was provenance, which of course was very relevant for me as a historian, which focused on milieu. Is it city, court, monastery, or other? User context, is it documentary, is it leisure, religious, devotional? Scriptorium, scribes, patrons, owners, gender of the owner. Another category was codicology, so everything about dimensions, writing support, average dimensions, columns, lines, and then we had a different category focusing on decoration, illumination, and on scripts and script type. So let's focus on what you can do with such a data set and how I used it in my research. So when we look at Bruges as a sort of society, multilingual society or multilingual contact zone, of course, it has been studied that Bruges, and Hanno Weisman has published on this, had quite an exceptional position in the Middle Ages as a leading city of book illumination in the 15th century Low Countries. So it didn't come as a surprise in her data set that of the 2,500 Flemish manuscripts that we had, 801 books seem to have been produced in Bruges between 1200 and 1500. And this makes Bruges by far the largest book production center in late medieval Flanders, leaving other major writing centers like Ghent, which is about 300, and Lille, about 200, far behind. So, and as you can see on the table on the slide, this is actually a late medieval phenomenon. So the largest subdivision, so 745 of those manuscripts were actually written in the 15th century, as you can see. In the 13th century, book production in Bruges was actually limited to larger monastic and ecclesiastical institutes, such as the Donation Church. And the data set includes 34 manuscripts written in 13th century Bruges. Latin was obviously the dominant language still in the 13th century, but also a very few Middle Dutch cases came to light, which actually all dates from the late quarter of the 13th century. But remarkable, we didn't have a single Francophone manuscript. We probably missed them in our 13th century data sets. So what do we know, for instance, for the 13th century, that Douai and Lille were still very important for book production. So the economic and political instability of the 14th century becomes visible as well. It's resulted in overall decline in manuscript production, not only in Bruges, but also in our entire data set in Flanders. So we have 21 manuscripts from Bruges for the 14th century in our data sets. And in Low Countries and France, but there are other studies on this as well, manuscript preservation apparently suffered more from political and an economic crisis than in the Holy Roman Empire or England, for instance. So although this data of the 14th century is extremely fragmentary. We actually see a lot of, quite a big proportion of vernacular texts. All 14th century multilingual manuscripts also include at least one text in Dutch, which is quite remarkable. So as a rising literary language, Dutch was apparently often combined with other languages in the 14th century. However, important side note, the inclusion of Dutch alongside French or Latin in a multilingual manuscript could actually indicate both two things, both a high or a low level of multilingualism. Either the book owner read in multiple languages with facility, or the reader's French or Latin was insufficient to understand the text without instruction in Dutch. And which is also remarkable, as vernacular combinations of French and Middle Dutch texts in one manuscript are actually extremely rare in Bruges, but also in the Flemish dataset in general. And this is what we also see in other regions. For instance, Christa Murchison has worked on England, and she has found very little multilingual manuscripts where French and English text were actually combined together in one manuscript. So there is often more the mediation of a third language, often Latin. This, of course, does not mean that Flemish readers did not read or owned books both with French and Middle Dutch texts, but simply that these texts were generally not combined in a single manuscript. So the drop of production in the 14th century makes expansion from the early 15th century onwards actually all the more impressive. It's actually really a boom of manuscript production in the 15th century. So the majority, of course, of these manuscripts are French monolingual manuscripts, followed by Latin, various multilingual combinations, and then Dutch, and a small number also other languages, which is mainly English, Spanish, Low German, and Italian, almost all in multilingual combinations with Latin. If we look at some other features of these manuscripts, well, there's a clear difference in materiality as well between manuscripts in different languages. Francophone manuscripts tend to be quite a bit larger than Dutch or Latin books. And this is, of course, very genre-related. Latin books of hours tend to be smaller for practical use, whereas French romances were written in luxuriously illuminated large books for public reading. So French and Latin manuscripts were often richly illuminated and written on parchment, whereas most common writing support of Dutch manuscripts actually paper. And for instance, I've done my PhD on this chronicle, the Excellent Chronique van Vlaanderen, as some people might know. But I didn't realize it's only by analyzing them in context of this data set that it's actually quite rare that these manuscripts are written on paper and not on parchment. The reason why Dutch manuscripts in Bruges were more often written on paper is not always clear. There could be a link to urban administration, but actually the urban administration was also most often written on parchment. So if someone has the answer, I'm happy to know actually. Although it's often hard to exactly date a specific manuscript, especially to a certain decade, I did it anyway. So interesting conclusions can actually be made if you have a sort of manuscript fluctuation per decade. And I based this graph actually mostly on Weismann's data set. So as you can see, actually, there was shortly before and after the murder of Duke John the Fearless in 1419, book production actually stagnated due to socioeconomic problems. A second increase in manuscript production actually then correlates with a political difficult period, which was the crisis years of the Bruges Revolt of 1436, 1438. It's not always economics that has an impact on book production. Furthermore, it's actually after and you can see it really well here, is after 1450 and especially from 1460 onwards, that there was a sort of boom in book production and also a transition into sort of cheaper products made for free market rather than the luxury books on commission. This sort of high in demand production corresponds with two trends. First is that the Bruges Librarian Guild, of course, professionalized and invested in more sophisticated administration, holding a yearly account in this period of their members, including donations, fees, apprentice enrollment. And a second one, as is shown by this graph, by the graph on the slide, is of course the dominance of French in manuscript production, which was actually a growing phenomenon of the second half of the 15th century. So actually before, French is this sort of latte color here, and before 1414, the 14th century trend actually continued when Dutch was actually far more common than French. So it's actually particular after 1450 that you see this change. So looking more closely at main target audience and social user mailings of manuscripts produced in Bruges, as expected, the largest sales market of the luxurious illuminated books were, of course, courts and noble circles. However, there was a significant urban audience as well. And this urban audience was actually more multilingual, as you can see on the graph, high variety of different languages than courts. So the courts and nobility commissioned almost exclusively francophone monolingual languages, francophone monolingual manuscripts, better. Data for urban manuscripts is much more diverse. But this has actually to do with the high number of multilingual manuscripts, which is also associated with books of hours, of course, which was also typically a product that was owned by this urban elite. So one could wonder again if this high level of multilingual manuscripts combining more than one language actually indicate a high level or rather a low level of multilingualism, where you need vernacular assistance with reading a Latin text, actually. So scholarship has mainly focused on Bruges as an export city for books. And in the second half of the 15th century, the quantity of works produced for the open markets actually increased. But in our data set, indeed, 209 manuscripts were indeed intended for a non-Flemish buyer. But our data set also actually adds some nuance to the image of Bruges working exclusively for an export market, because more manuscripts were commissioned by or intended for Flemish use. Of course, you have the Burgundian dukes here. We included them as Flemish people, or their court at least. But even without them, 255 of the 745 manuscripts have known medieval Flemish users. So if we look at exports, as you can see here, this big circle, England was the most important market for Bruges manuscripts, in particular for Latin books of hours and literary texts in French, followed by Italy and northern France. So I was wondering who's writing all these French manuscripts in Bruges, because the ability to accurately copy manuscripts in different languages actually requires a high level of language proficiency from a small group of professional writers. And among the Royal Collection of the British Library, there's a 15th century manuscript which transmits a French translation of the Imago Mundi by Gosselin of Metz. And in the manuscript colophon, we read that the book was copied by Le Commandement of the librairie Jean de Clercq. And an almost identical exemplar is now in the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. and holds actually a similar colophon, implying that the manuscripts were not copied by de Klerk himself, but under his supervision. And de Klerk was one of the most productive Bruges librarians from the 15th century, and a contemporary of another famous Bruges librarian and printer, Collard-Mention. Probably descendant from a wealthy family of local brokers and mercenaries. De Klerk enrolled in the Librarians Guild in 1455 and was named Dean of the Guild afterwards. De Klerk enrolled 7 apprentices, and that's interesting, 6 boys and a girl, Barbara Tant. She was the daughter of a Bruges candle maker, Jan Tant. Notably is that some apprentices were deliberately recruited from the southern Francophone part of the county of Flanders, or other nearby Francophone regions, such as Ghent, who originated from Lille, and Guillaume Buret, who was born in Cambrai. And Ghent might ring a bell because he would eventually be appointed keeper of the Royal Library of the English King Henri II. So this shows that Jan de Klerk actually invested in a sort of multilingual workshop of scribes, including native speakers of both vernaculars. Although we know that de Klerk was proficient in written French, he preferred to engage native-speaking scribes in the writing process of his Francophone manuscripts, which actually improved, of course, the quality of his products. And therefore, Jan de Klerk, I wrote that this was also a sort of micro-contact zone between French and Dutch native-speaking scribes, both from Bruges, such as Barbara Tant, and from the Francophone south of Flanders, such as Ghent. Another example I want to discuss is how private writing contexts are also really important. If such a large proportion of manuscripts was actually intended for Flemish users, this shows not only the significance of the Flemish market for Bruges librarians, but also that manuscript writing was not strictly limited to professional networks. And this manuscript actually shows this is the Flemish Boëtius. The manuscript is a Middle Dutch verse translation of Boëtius' De Constellatione Philosophiae. It's partially based on the Latin original, but mostly on the pseudo-Jean de Meaux French version. It was translated by the Bruges goldsmith Jacob Vilt, and the Boëtius manuscript was finished by a scribe in the 1470s, A. Drubbel. Both author and scribe were based in Bruges. Perhaps they knew each other. Jacob Vilt is identified as a goldsmith in the Boëtius manuscripts, and indeed, in a charter of the goldsmiths in 1454, he's mentioned as one of the noble members of the Goldsmiths Guild. And goldsmiths were, of course, highly educated, skilled artisans, and the craft guild was dominated by a small number of very rich, influential families. Skilled artisans, merchants invested in what we call sort of linguistic capital through education and school manuals to successfully engage in trade, and were practically bilingual. Moreover, the Vilt family, they were active in all sorts of luxury crafts. There is a Jan Vilt who is a member of the Librarians Guild, a Michiel Vilt who is a member of the Smiths Guild and the Painters Guild. So the accent manuscripts, this Flemish Boëtius manuscript of Bruges Boëtius, as I'll call it, is a multilingual codex. So the largest part of the text is written in Dutch. There are Latin and French quotes, and much less is known about the sort of mysterious A. Drubbel. The name of the scribe is explicitly mentioned in the colophon of the manuscript, but also in a word game. You can find it here. A and then drup, and there's a little bell here, so it's called a rebus at the beginning of the manuscript, which kind of resonates with the work of Chambers of Rhetoric. So this Flemish Boëtius manuscript not only illustrates this sort of polyglot urban context in Bruges, but also how multilingual professional and semi-professional, such as the Chambers of Rhetoric, writing networks actually overlapped. Yeah, it's a compelling case of Flemish of this sort of Bruges functioning as a contact zone on multiple levels between urban networks, professional librarians, their workshop, non-professional scribes and authors, between French-speaking illuminators, bilingual translator, Middle Dutch authors, and scribes. So I'll quickly go to the last case study I want to present to you, which is a gender shifting focus on Bruges. I now want to explore this individual dimension of multilingualism, examining gendered patterns of multilingual book ownership in late medieval Flanders. So how multilingual were women actually in medieval Flanders? What does the data set actually tells us? And of course, for first, it's only for 1582 of the manuscripts in our data set that the gender of the first owner is known. And unsurprisingly, both individual laymen, but also male institutions such as abbeys, were by far the most common book owners in late medieval Flanders. Only 202 manuscripts could be attributed to female owners, both private owners, but also female convents. This is also a little bit lower than what is typically observed for Low Countries, for instance, comparing to Weismann's research. But of course, Hanno Weismann has focused on luxury manuscripts, and this indicates a slightly high percentage of female owners because books of hours, of course, for instance, were illuminated, books of hours were typically a more female genre. There's also this problem of sort of bias of the sources because coat of arms might refer to male family members, but this does not imply that women did not have access to these books, because we know, for instance, for Margaret of York, that she actually read a lot of books of the deceased Philip the Good and that she had access to them. So yeah, there are other problems with this data, of course. So it sort of became evident also in my talk already that genre plays quite a crucial role in analyzing multilingualism, and prompting the question of how gender, genre, and language actually intersect and influence each other. Our data set actually confirms that there's an idea of a typical man's library and a typical woman's library in Flanders, in medieval Flanders, as you can see here. As you can see on the graph, Flemish men, the library collections of Flemish men were consisted of a wider variety of genres than women's. So manuscripts owned by women were most commonly books of hours or devotional manuscripts, as listed here in our data set. This, of course, does not mean that women did not engage with other genres. And there are some typically male genres, such as classics and chronicles. But there are also gender-neutral genres, such as, for instance, literary texts, romances, practical books, school texts, pilgrimage guides, medical manuals. So we find them equally in both contexts. The graph on the slide actually illustrates a sort of shift in the number of manuscripts owned by women or by women's institutions from the 13th to the 15th century, with specific attention to the evolution of language. Again, of course, a remarkable increase in the 15th century, which is, of course, related to preservation context as well, but also book production that increases. So I think some important observations to mention there is that vernacular languages were actually quite rare still in the 12th century, which is kind of odd, of course, because in other research on the 13th century and the rise of the vernacular, women have been very involved in this. And we know, for instance, from the Flemish court of Margaret of Constantinople that she has a rich Francophone cultural environment. But they owned mostly Latin psalters, as is now also in the collection of the public library in Bruges. And secondly, it's also important to note that the number of manuscripts actually doesn't drop in the 14th century, and it stays equal, whereas if you look at Flanders in general, we have a sort of decline of manuscripts. So women didn't really had an influence of this 14th century problem. And it's also, again, what we see this in general, a sort of rise in multilingualism. and in particular a rise in Dutch. And it appears that women who owned books played actually a distinctive role in promoting, circulating, and consuming Dutch manuscripts in Flanders. And if we look at milieu, then Dutch manuscripts were especially common among female owners, primarily due to Dutch literary activities of religious women in convents in the northern part of Flanders. So Flemish religious women played a significant role in introducing Dutch in the data sets. In contrast, Flemish noble women predominantly engaged with monolingual Francophone manuscripts, surprise. And yeah, urban women were tend to be more multilingual, which of course, again, it's not that there are more multilingual, but perhaps that they need assistance of vernacular languages to read, for instance, a Latin book of hour, as you can see here on the slide. So I'd like to conclude. So in conclusion, medieval manuscripts or medieval Flanders better can be seen as a sort of vibrant multilingual contact zone where multiple languages coexisted, though few individuals likely mastered all of these languages. And this actually highlights this sort of distinction between individual and societal multilingualism, which I think is quite important. Another important thing is that the presence of multilingual manuscripts can indicate both a high level of multilingualism, is that you include different texts that you read in different languages, but those manuscripts are actually quite rare. Actually, what we see more often is that it kind of indicates a low level of multilingualism, is that you need vernacular instructions because you can't read a text in Latin, or you need Dutch instructions because you can't read a text in French very well without them. So a multilingual manuscript does not always point to a multilingual reader. For this, context is important, and it's important to sort of come back from the data set and look at the actual manuscripts and the actual context in which these manuscripts are written. And I'd like to return to the song of the chaplain of Oedelem, because the chaplain's actions and the humor surrounding them reflect not only sort of societal critiques, but also possible misconceptions and a lack of true multilingualism in bad French, as we can read. So it's kind of underscores this tension, the complexity, but also a sort of comical aspect to navigating between multiple languages in a, of course, very culturally rich, but also a linguistically perhaps divided world that late medieval Flanders was. So thank you very much for your attention.